This is NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast BP.
And we're back talking about high dynamic range, or HDR. And during the brief break, we were talking about what we want to cover in this segment, and the topic that came up was monitors. So I'm going to let our esteemed guests, Mike Bergeron and Robert Carroll, talk to us a little bit about HDR monitors and the challenges that are brought up with that arena.
I think Mike's going to want me to jump in here.
Jump in.
He's going to pass it on to me. So I think the best place to start is that monitors in production and post-production, and monitor technology in production and post-production has been a difficult point in our ecosystem, probably since the point where cathode ray tubes went away and we started using LCDs. Moved on to plasmas in some use cases. And so as we move to HDR, I can't say that the difficulty of monitors has vastly improved. We do see a lot of hope in OLED technology, but there's some limitations currently in OLED technology
you
as
use
well.
the term, you have to define
OLED,
it. That's
yeah,
the rule.
organic LED, or organic light emitting diode.
What does that mean? Because that's just a bunch more words.
So it is an organic substance used in very similar way that we use LEDs.
Okay.
I think everybody knows what an LED is.
Yeah.
Hopefully everybody knows what an LED is.
I think we're safe with that one.
So it's another substance in which you make an LED.
Okay.
And the nice part about this is it has a couple different components. One is that you can control the color point of that a lot tighter.
Okay.
And the second is it can go very much into the dark levels. So it is being used for HDR TVs in both the consumer and in the professional monitor business, the consumer TV and professional monitor business. But it does have limitations on how bright it can get. So there are limitations in how much observable visual dynamic range you can really get out of it. But they are great. Don't get me wrong. They are great. It's a great technology. It's a great monitor. And there are other technologies that have been in use, oftentimes using LED and LCD technology that basically create higher dynamic range by modulating how the light source makes the image on the display. I won't get deep into that, but it's a method in which to create more dynamic range. And those types of technologies can get us an extreme amount of dynamic range, but at a cost. An economic cost.
Okay.
And,
what are we talking here?
Yeah.
How many zeros?
Well, the current probably market-leading product out there is a product that runs around $25,000. This is a professional product, so it's got very tight specs, very high uptime. It doesn't fail. It runs 24/7.
The level that this crew in
it's
the
a
NAB
professional monitor for
with.
professionals, right?
Right.
You're depending on your livelihood for it. You don't want to be concerned about small things, right?
Right.
So that's about where we are on the monitors today. I will say that there are a number of new announcements that have already started hitting the blogosphere, the ethersphere, if you want to call it that.
The favorite sphere.
The ethersphere. Maybe made a new term today. And it uses another methodology where multiple panels are mounted together to create an ability to control the light source with very, very high brightness lights.
So is it like a sandwich mounted together?
It's like a sandwich. It's like taking two LCD monitors and sandwiching them together.
Okay.
And this has a great potential as well. We're seeing that being demonstrated on the show floor this week. So.
And who's demonstrating that? Can you
well,
say?
I really don't feel that comfortable bringing it out, but I will say if you go to the typical manufacturers of monitors that are used in high-end, high-value post-production, you'll probably see things that are interesting at those places. So I don't want to miss somebody. So.
Okay, very fair, very fair.
In the broad sense, what we had was if we look back over the last few cycles of technology, we started out, we were all using CRTs. It was the same technology. You could make one a little bit better than the next one, and then all of a sudden there were all these other technologies, but we had the advantage of the spec for color space and for contrast was so small that they could all pretty much hit them. You know, it was within what everybody could do, so you could get everything to match. When we go to HDR, when we go to extended color gamut, all of a sudden we now have this ideal again that all these different technologies are trying to aspire to. So it gets very difficult. The range of quality in displays will now be much greater than it's been before. And then when we're looking at an industry that has over the years gotten very used to paying very little for their displays and getting something that was more than they needed. There's not that we've lost some of that institutional memory of what a really good grading display is and what other ones are.
A little sticker shock going on.
There is.
And also it's a situation where, again, you have something that was becoming, dare I say, commoditized. Where now you have to make a choice of where you're going to put one. If you're doing a HDR production, how many full quality QC displays can I have? How many standard dynamic range displays you're going to have? I mean, it wasn't long ago when you'd walk into a control room and there would be a whole lot of black and white monitors in there, just because it wasn't practical to have everything in color. I mean,
they were just confidence monitors at that
right,
time.
Right.
I mean, viewfinders were black and white until very recently, and I think viewfinders are going to be standard dynamic range for a while, and on-set monitoring.
Has anybody announced a viewfinder for HDR yet? That you know of? I haven't heard anything, but
I'm not sure. And one of the things that we've done well as we've made this progression or this transition to HDR is we set some standards up that really were the standards that are at a point of extreme diminishing return for human observation.
Okay.
In other words, a lot of times we set standards based on what can we do today, right? And so there's two standards. One is Rec 2020, which is the color standard. So it's Recommended Practice 2020, which is the color standard. That color volume, or the palette, as we've been describing, really is set to the outside edge of observable human differences. So in other words, if we went much further past that, most humans wouldn't be able to see that difference.
Here's my chance for my $10 word. It's the human psychovisual model, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yay
absolutely.
for me. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense that we don't want to throw bits at things that people can't see and hear. So.
Well, we don't. But the other point is we don't want to basically set a standard at what we can get done today, because if anything we've learned over the last 50 years is Moore's Law is real. And tomorrow we're going to be able to do it better than we did today, and that's progressively accelerating, it seems like, in our technology world. So if we set a point which we did with Rec 2020, whereas, if we go better than that, it really doesn't make any difference, then what we have is we have a situation where in monitor technology, there are monitors that are providing the ability of seeing an image in that Rec 2020 container, but they can't show all the colors yet. Tomorrow they'll show more. A few weeks from now they'll show more.
Right. So
we're progressively getting better.
I understand that this term was on NAB buzzword bingo, but we're future proofing, right? So we're making sure that the content we create today displays as well as possible on the monitors that we have tomorrow, right?
That is one of the goals of many of the issues and efforts going on around HDR, is to try to keep it consistent as we have continued iteration of our technology and capabilities.
So is there any sense as we transition to this HDR technology and 4K and all of these other things, there were sort of cheats. There were things you could get away with that the audience wouldn't see, right? I mean, how has that changed over the last?
Well, I really, it's one of the things I selfishly like about HDR being introduced in the picture is we've always, as we're designing products, we don't want to spend money on something that no one can see.
Right.
And so it's very difficult to make an argument. So can we extend the color gamut of the next generation imager? Can we get if we're already exceeding every display standard out there, then it's very difficult to go and get the budget for the experiment to bring it to the next level. But at this point, with 2020 and with HDR, we're stretching to get a gamut that will cover all of that. And so as a as an engineer, I want us to be working on that. So we've got somewhere to go with it.
As a producer, though, I'm scared because the first time.
Fair enough.
The first time I, as a younger person, went and saw a television set in real life, like a game show set, I was appalled. I was like, this looks horrible up close and in person. But on TV it looked great, and so I think there's a learning curve for us producers as well, making sure that everything that we create is up to the standard of this new visual capability. I mean, have you seen any traumas with that going forward?
There's been a few instances where, again, I was talking about how in production and on-set dailies and even in visual effects and other things, oftentimes they may be working in standard dynamic range display systems. And there's been cases where composites and other things didn't quite come out correctly once it was seen in high dynamic range. But those are easily corrected, and we have such a quick iterative cycle on producing content, especially feature film content, that when a problem is seen, 6 hours later you got the correction and you're continuing on. So. There is truth to the matter, though, that you do have to pay attention. If you want to finish in high dynamic range, it's best that you start in high dynamic range as much as you can in every part of it. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. What you see is what you get, pretty much. So there is word on the street about format wars and format issues when it comes to HDR, and I would just like you guys to talk about how a person going into Best Buy or a big box store should look at HDR in terms of being an emerging technology, and where's the overlap, and is it safe to buy HDR right now? I mean, I know that's a tough question. I know it's a loaded question.
I'll jump in on that. I think it is safe to buy HDR right now.
Okay.
I mean, there are products out there. There are things out there. The concept of format war, I think it was been pretty well addressed in a couple areas, in that there are some stratus of HDR as far as good, better, best. And in the case where there are systems that are providing the best HDR format, they also support the other formats as well. So it's not that a consumer is necessarily going to lose out.
Oh, this is sort of like my receiver, right? Where my Denon receiver is Switzerland. It can play, it can play all the different audio formats, even though they compete.
Right, exactly. So I don't know that this is going to be a consumer problem. I think where we see contention and where we see some discussion is around how the ecosystem pulls together. How do content distributors decide if the format's right? Just real quick, jump in there quick, Mike. But one thing we're doing at Dolby is we're very holistic at how we approach it. Our content creation tools that create Dolby Vision also can create the HDR10 standard.
Okay.
And our chipsets that go into Dolby Vision televisions are absolutely programmed to also do the HDR10 standard. So we're approaching it holistically as Dolby Vision is a premium HDR experience, and we support HDR10 in all of our systems as well.
Very cool.
I would say from a camera perspective, from production equipment, I would say it's not safe to not buy HDR. I think you better, if you're looking at a camera, if you're going to get a camera, you better get something that's got a high dynamic range now, because of the limitation of dynamic range that we had before. That enabled us to make more affordable cameras and smaller cameras and do all these things and increase resolution at the expense of dynamic range, but because we were already beyond what was needed, you couldn't see it. And so when we go to HDR, all of a sudden that little teeny tiny camera may not support that, or that consumer camera might not support that. And so when you look at things like the imager size, the dynamic range of a pixel, let's say, of a photosite, is determined in part by its size and its sensitivity. The bigger it is, the more sensitive it is, and the more light it can see before it saturates. So the more dynamic range it has. So if you're going from from SD to HD to 4K, and you're keeping the same imager size, your dynamic range is going to be difficult to maintain the dynamic range. And if you're trying to do 4K and HDR at the same time, you would really be better to have a larger imager, which of course means larger optics, and so it's something you do want to think about.
Speaking of doing 4K and HDR at the same time, let's talk a little bit about streaming HDR and 4K. Because I'm wondering how often, when we're told we're watching 4K and we're watching HDR, we really are. I mean, do you have a sense of where that's all falling out in the bit budget?
Well, I mean, in terms of what you're watching on streaming and things, it comes down to the encoding that's being used. H.265 supports HDR. H.264 doesn't really. So, if you've got a system that's supporting, one of the newer codecs that's supporting HDR, and they're becoming fairly prolific out there, then you can have it. Unfortunately, cable head ends haven't installed these encoders yet, for the most part. For terrestrial broadcasts, we've got to wait to ATSC 3.0.
Right. We have to have a little when we say ATSC 3.0.
Oh, we're doing that now?
Yeah. Okay. That's what I'm doing, because everybody's seeing that sort of as.
Well, we got all the way to the middle of the second half before we brought it up.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, so there's the question of delivering it, right, and it's most of it is going to be OTT. Over the top at this point.
Right.
But I don't think this is a new thing with HDR. We had the same problem with HD, right?
Right.
And companies that have an intentful eye out for their consumer experience that provide OTT type streaming services, really pay attention to that and do things like buffer ahead and make sure that the things are there. So there is definitely a collective effort to make that experience be correct. And yes, just like the HD bandwidth and what you are actually seeing, HDR will have those same issues.
I would say that I agree with you in part, but I think there's an important difference, and that is that a lot of times the consumer can't tell the difference between SD and HD, and the consumer has an even more difficult time telling between HD and 4K. But you put standard dynamic range picture next to a high dynamic range picture, and the difference is profound. So do you think that the consumer might be able to tell a little better, or that's what I'm wondering?
That's a great question. It's an area I haven't paid much attention
Yeah, it's
to.
not really fair.
I'm in the post-production side.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what sort of faux HDR we get. I mean, I guess you could just put a very bright picture and say, hey, it's HDR, and leave out the shadows. I'm trying to think of, if I was trying to scam someone into believing something was HDR, I would just make it really bright. Because if you tried to cheat it another way, I think you're going to get a lot of banding, and it's going to be pretty easy to spot.
Well, okay, that brings us to another quick thing. What are some of the artifacts and errors and trouble areas that we see in HDR that isn't executed particularly well? How do you know your HDR stinks? You mentioned a few there.
What Mike was speaking of is having enough bits to show. So if you take something like a gradation, which oftentimes shows up in a sky. So you've got a scene where you've got a nice forest in the front and a beautiful blue sky, and there's a nice gradation because the sun's on the left side of the screen. Those things require a lot of gradations, and as you move more and more in HDR, you need the extra bits to show that.
Right.
So having the ability to have enough bit depth to do that. Now, we've been traditionally in an 8-bit system, even up till recently, and 10 bits, even for most HDR systems, has proven to be enough. So if you're in that 10 to 12 bit range, that's great. If you look at long format cinematic, feature film type stuff, that's all created mostly in a 16-bit image format, mostly all the way through the process. So there is plenty of bit depth in there for a lot of these artifacts, but that is something you need to be aware of. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm old enough to remember Johnny Carson. So we're going to do our thing now where we look at the future. You guys can each give me your view of the HDR future.
Okay.
Why don't you go first?
I think one of the things that's going to drive HDR is the growth of people viewing most of their content on some kind of handheld device.
Okay.
And I think while it is very difficult to get 4K resolution into something that's maybe 6 inches across.
Well, do you need to get 4K resolution if it's...
You do not.
Yeah.
So then how do you sell it?
Right.
You get HDR because
Okay.
you can get the brightness, at least enough brightness to make something impactful, if not to get what you can on a larger screen. So I think a lot of HDR content is going to be consumed on handheld devices because it's a good differentiator for your content. If people are just streaming through something, they may not notice that it's higher resolution if they're looking on a phone. But HDR will still make them think that it's going to explode, which actually is probably a bad way to put it.
Yeah, given our recent history, we probably don't want to talk about exploding phones. Okay. Robert, you want to give it a whirl?
Sure. So I believe that we adapt and adopt and our tastes change over time. And I think as more people see HDR images and then go back and start looking at SDR images, they're going to say, well, I want that in HDR now, because they're going to notice that difference. They're going to see that difference. Whether it's on the phone, in the cinema, in the home, wherever it is, I think they will eventually get used to that. I know I can say that I saw this with my parents and even my wife, that they couldn't tell the difference between standard definition and high definition first on, and then after a while they would say, why is the TV so fuzzy? I'm like, well, you've got the standard definition channel on, flip it over to this channel. And oh yeah, and so it took a while for people to recognize that this isn't as good as I was seeing before. What's wrong? And we live it every day. We study it, we measure it, we calculate it. Some people don't pay that much attention to it, so it takes a little longer for them to realize, oh, wait a minute, that was better than this. Let's go to that all the time now.
Right.
So that's a transition that will happen. Yep.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I think that, this move to mobile devices, especially given the thriftiness of the HDR capabilities in terms of bandwidth, it makes a lot of sense. And I think we are going to get used to this. This is going to be our new default. And I sometimes wonder if we're going to have the equivalent of colorizing those old movies, if we're going to take some of that film stock that we have that has all of that in it, and we're going to repackage
We've been
for
doing
the home.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that'll be
if you
something.
can go back to the negatives, you can pull it out.
Well, Mr. Scorsese is certainly doing his part to keep those vaults alive, and now there's another commercial reason why we should do that. So I'm not really sure how we ended up from HDR to film vaults, but we but we made that journey
film
together.
vaults are HDR.
You're right.
Vaults are HDR. They were always HD and they were always HDR.
But we made that journey together. So any last words of parting wisdom you have for our audience out there as they embark on their HDR journey?
Enjoy the show. It's going to be a lot of good stuff out there.
Yeah, I think you can't go wrong. I mean, anything that's HDR is going to work amazingly well in standard dynamic range. So don't be afraid to experiment with it.
All right. So we've got wider color. We've got brighter brights. We've got darker darks. We have, all in all, a brighter future ahead, I think, with HDR. And I really want to thank you so much, Robert Carroll and Mike Bergeron, for being on the show with me today and talking through a lot of the nitty-gritty and the nits, as I said, which, by the way, is a measure of brightness. That's what that terrible pun is all about. But talk through us about all of the details in producing fantastic, colorful, bright HDR. So I'm really thrilled to be here at NAB. I hope you get a chance to go and look at some of Dolby and Panasonic's displays where they're going to be showing off HDR in all its glory. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great day.
from 102.5 The Bone, Tampa, Florida, and you are watching NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast Beat.
I know broadcasters will continue to find opportunity in the choices we make. Choices that allow broadcasters to continue serving the American people.
And we'll see you at the 2017 NAB show.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah.
Howdy, I'm Jack Harris, a quasi-journalist with News Radio 970 WFLA, Tampa Bay. You're watching NAB Show Live.
Hi, I'm Cindy Edwards.
And I'm Jerry Penacoli from the nationally syndicated show Daytime.
And you're watching NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast Beat.
Hi, I'm Patrick Harris with Gallaudet University TV, and you're watching NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast Beat Magazine.
Broadcasters will continue to find opportunity in the choices we make. Choices that allow broadcasters to continue serving the American people.
And we'll see you at the 2017 NAB show.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Torres. I'm a mobile journalist at Full Sail University, and you're watching NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast Beat.
I'm Kerry Sanders, a correspondent with NBC News. I'm in Tampa right now, and you're watching NAB Show Live.
Live from Las Vegas, this is NAB Show Live, produced by Broadcast Beat.
Hi, Hi there, Jeanette DePatty here at NAB Show Live, and I am going to be talking about the cloud with you in this segment. Now, the cloud we often think of as this lovely, white, fluffy thing. Oops, I'm having a little drama with my ear thing here. Let me just get that over. Sorry about that. So the cloud is a white, fluffy thing we think of as beautiful, but sometimes I think the cloud is really more like a storm cloud that sends a zap to hit us right in the behind. So I'm going to start by telling you a little story about Jill. Jill started a new job as the CTO or the CIO of a production company, and she was so excited because the CEO said the cloud is going to save us money and give us so much more productivity and so much more flexibility. And poor Jill, she started the job, and on her first day, she realized that the previous CTO and CIO had left her absolutely no documentation. The sales manager informed her that she needed no less than 12 apps to do her job. And the marketing team was screaming about the trailer that was cut 6 months ago that nobody could find. Poor Jill. Luckily, today we have some cloud experts that can help us avoid poor Jill's situation, and I'm very excited to introduce them here today. I'd like to start by talking with you, Josh. Josh is, I want to talk to you about metadata, right? Because the idea of metadata is that it flows through everything. It's the data about the content that sticks to the content wherever it goes, but I think we find often that metadata is sort of Teflon coated, right? It sort of slips off. So talk to me about metadata.
Metadata that's transactional. There's metadata like what a file format is, things that can be acquired automatically, and things that might be something that a human generated and wants to associate with a file. So you might have notes about things, for example. These things, in a production context, if you're doing this in one location, say on set, then often these kinds of things can get separated from the materials they describe. So the downstream, it's a nightmare trying to put it all back together. That's this Teflon coating you're talking about. So the industry's moved towards standardizing a new identification system that allows us to create an indelible relationship. We call it indelible metadata, and we create a relationship between...
Let me stop you there. Sure. Indelible metadata. That sounds cool, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound like something that everybody wants?
Yeah, and that's why, as an industry as a whole, we've been trying to solve this problem for a while, because the solution to date has been use an application, put your metadata in it, and as long as you're using that application, things stay together. But what you really need in the real world is stuff that moves through applications, and no difference between the applications breaks the relationships. So with this new identification system called C4, we have the ability now to create this indelibility idea where we can have an ID for an asset that's always the same. Anybody anywhere in the world will find the same ID for that asset. And we can have an ID for metadata. And if you put those two things together, or if in the metadata you have a link to the C4 ID in it, then you can always discover those relationships, even if you're not using the original software.
So where does this C4 data live?
So it's an ID, it's a string like a URL, and you can take that string and put it as a record in a database. You can just copy and paste it into some notes. It's very easy and ergonomic to work with in any kind of software. It's just a text string that's 90 characters long. So any file, every bit of data in the world has a unique C4 ID, and two different people in different locations who aren't coordinating together will always come up with the same C4 ID for the same data.
So who's responsible for building this C4? I mean, what group is making that happen?
Most of the work on the open source standard has happened through the Entertainment Technology Center, which is a think tank that works with USC and is funded by all the major studios to come up with new technologies like this.
Very cool. So you mentioned sometimes that when you transition, things break. And with that, I'd like to speak with our next guest, Daryl Strauss, about the transition process. Like, what happens to the data when you move from one arena to another arena?
Right, so in our modern productions, we have a lot of different teams that are working with the content. And as Josh was pointing out, I mean, there's metadata that starts on set, there's extra editorial copies and recoloring that happens there, there's marketing pulls that need to reference the same material. So we have this whole pool of vendors that all need to pull out of the same content, have the same metadata, and know what the world looks like, right? What your production's data looks like.
All in the middle of the chaos of live production.
All in the middle of the chaos and changing over time, right? And so what we've done at Technicolor is we've built this system we call Pulse, and that's our central repository. So we can take all that data, we can open it up, we have open APIs for people to talk to it, and that allows any vendor to go ask us, what content have you got? What metadata is associated with it? And ask for the copies and process it and push it through our system. And that's to get that cooperation between all the folks that are working on your production.
So it sounds like there's potentially another major gulf between production and post-production. So sort of mind the gap, right? Can you talk a little bit about that transition, which seems like another danger area?
Right. In fact, I would argue almost the opposite. There is getting to be less and less separation between production and post-production.
Okay.
Right? My marketing department wants to do a pull from the original material that happened immediately. As soon as it came off the camera, if they had their choice, they would do that, right? So again, that's that stop passing your data from one group to another, bring it into a central repository where everybody can access it and everybody knows they have the correct, current, up-to-date version of whatever asset they're trying to get to.
Right. And then next, you need to package it up and get ready for delivery. And I think that's another spot where our next guest, Brian Quant, you can talk a little bit about your current project and...
Yeah, so I'm the Vice President of Engineering for a product called AutoDCP. And AutoDCP is a tool used by the feature film industry and independent film in the cloud to package your content into the industry standard for film distribution and film playback by the Digital Cinema Initiative called DCPs. What's really cool about the cloud today is we can do all this without a lot of infrastructure. We don't need the hardware. We now have the capability, as Daryl is saying, is to put this into a centralized location that all of us vendors can actually get access to and turn it into the deliverables, for example, what AutoDCP does, or turn it into other deliverables that might be suitable for television and or OTT delivery and all that. And we have the ability, or our whole industry now that we're cooperating, utilizing these type of resources, we have the ability to shorten that gap, both from the production side to post as well as to distribution. And you'll hear terms today, for example, as probably go on to some of to our next person here, Michael, is how quickly we're now able to actually simultaneously release to many, many locations throughout the world.
So I did pick up the word cooperation and collaboration, and I think that seems to be an important part of this process. And, I wonder, Michael, if you can talk to us about what Sony C does in terms of making that collaboration smooth and possible and easy.
Sure. So Sony C is Sony's media cloud platform. We basically are built on top of an AWS infrastructure, so Amazon Web Services, but we've built out this structure and capability whereby you can upload, share, ingest, review, and approve content, and in Brian's case, even pull that content back down so you can package that into a DCP. And that's a nice integration that we've built with our open APIs. And we do a lot more, delivery and distribution. We have wonderful customers like Sony Pictures Entertainment and Tegna Gannett, as well as Public Media Management System that powers about 11 to 12 PBS stations. And every day, every week, we deliver out and distribute that content out, both for the collaboration aspect of it, like you said, and very good point about that, but also for the realistic aspect of getting something out to play out. So, getting something ready, prepped, and then getting that ready to be distributed out and played out. Even in an OTT circumstance, you could also leverage our entire environment for that same thing. Most common thing we come across, and I think it's routine across the industry, is how do you share content in a secure way and in a way where you do facilitate post, production, marketing workflows, because your point was a very valid one, Daryl. I mean, everyone is trying to crunch these things into one layer now, and it becomes very complicated if you don't have the right tools. Well, we're fully cloud-based, right? So everything we've got is available anywhere in the world. And that's the power of the cloud, is that we can auto-scale, make it available, and make it easy for someone to use. That's another part of it, is you don't want to always have to call IT, right? You want to be able to go and have a dialogue at a business level and encourage those folks at that business level. And that's what we do.
So it sounds so wonderful, right? I mean, it sounds like almost like a panacea. And sometimes I wonder if talking about the cloud is kind of this generation's "we'll fix it in post." You know, is there a sense of, well, we won't worry about it. We'll do it in the cloud. We'll kick the can down the line. And so I wonder if you could talk to some of the challenges. I mean, whoever wants to jump in, talk to some of the challenges that the cloud presents, some of the unique challenges.
I mean, that is almost exactly the idea here, is that people are pushing into the idea because the business idea, I think, is obvious. The value of the cloud is clear. You can collaborate with remote collaborators around the world. You can have unbounded amounts of storage. You can have unbounded amounts of compute, and you can turn it off when you're done using it. But you got to move your data there, you got to track all of it, you got to keep the relationships between the things as that data moves around. And that's one of the key ideas behind having an ID system that can discover the connections between things. Because often what you find is you don't want to move your data around. If you have something like Technicolor and Pulse, then you want to ingest your data during production into their services and leave it there, because your color's probably going to happen there, and maybe you need VFX pulls to go to some place, but then they know when you say, here's our EDL for the effects pull, they know what you're talking about, right? It's not a whole bunch of different groups.
Yeah, and I think I can speak to a little of that as well in other areas I've been involved with, not necessarily related to our Hollywood media entertainment technology type world. We seem to be not necessarily when we go to the cloud, we have a business that's currently running, but quite frankly, nobody really knows yet how each of all these divisions are communicating, what is the data they really need other than the division internal. And as we try to move and start to represent this in the cloud, it's actually very difficult to start to understand what is the data that this department needs versus that department, and to get the company to start to create an engineering plan to accommodate that.
Wait, you mean it's not like a magical Harry Potter kind of place?
There is not an app for that.
That you just wave your magic wand and all of a sudden this machine fixes everything? You have to have people and a plan?
That's exactly how the cloud works.
And I'll point out another one. At the high-end production end, the bandwidth and getting it to where the shoot is done is a real problem that we refer to as the last mile problem.
Okay.
A big production will shoot 5 terabytes of content a day, right, for 100 days of shoot. Moving 500 terabytes of data into the cloud is difficult and slow.
Yeah.
And so
one of the things... That seems like a bit of an understatement.
Well, I'll give you, this is the technical view of the world. We move that around all the time, right? But this is our end. So this is I'm talking about the big end of the problem, right? But we've provided, because we have facilities around the world, we've actually been able to provide you some of that assistance, right? So we can have our on-location team send content to one of our local offices, and there we have our fast interconnects to then get to the cloud and move the data around. We also have we have the Technicolor private cloud plus a public cloud version of Pulse. So our clients can say, I want your data to live in the technical data center in London, and we've got a direct wire between that and you, right? So we can work directly with you guys very closely, right? Or you can say, I want it in the public cloud, and it'll be available anywhere in the world.
Okay, so we have a rule when I'm a host. Whenever you use a term, you have to define it.
Okay.
So talk about the difference between the private cloud and the public cloud.
Okay, sure enough. So when we talk about cloud computing, first of all, let's define what cloud computing really means, right?
Okay, great.
One thing that people will say is, well, gee, my servers live on some data center somewhere. That's the easy way to start describing the cloud, right? It's not a server, it's not software I run on my own computer. It's running off in some data center somewhere else, right? But cloud's actually more than that, right? right? Cloud is, are your machines available all the time? Are there people managing them? Is there a scalable amount of compute and storage and everything else that goes with that, right? So you need all those pieces, computers, storage, service people, network, all that has to be there to really be a cloud application. Okay, so now we've defined what a cloud means. The Technicolor private cloud is us building our data centers around the Technicolor network around the world. So we have ones in London, we have ones out here, we have people in Vancouver, right? All of that is interconnected through the Technicolor network, right? And you can still get to it from your browser at home, right? Anywhere you are.
And the distinction being that you physically own and control that hardware.
Technicolor owns all the hardware. You as the vendor, you as a producer don't have to own the hardware. Technicolor does it for you. And then we lease you the time and compute storage you need to work on your production. So that's a private cloud because Technicolor runs it. Amazon or Google or Microsoft, right, all run what we refer to as public clouds. And at this point, Hollywood is not involved with those servers. Those servers are run by other big companies, right? And all we're doing is renting the time and CPUs from Amazon and then reselling them to you as the producer, right? So that's the difference between the public cloud and the private cloud. We have more control over a private cloud. We can put it in machine rooms. We can physically wire it together. All those kinds of things that are harder to do with a public cloud infrastructure.
Very cool. Yeah, I've also heard of the elusive hybrid cloud. Do you want to take that one on while we're at it, while we're on the subject?
So you're getting down to some of the minutia, but yes, you can also mix those models, right? So if I have a facility, and let's say I have 100 computers in my room, and I need 110, right? I can now mix my content. I can kind of go, this all lives in my private cloud, and now I've extended out to the public cloud to get some more capacity, and I hybrid the model and mix between them, right?
Very cool. So we can all take our gloves off and talk about which one is best. Public, private, hybrid, which one?
I think they all have their merits.
Yeah.
Okay.
They do. I mean, I think it really boils down to, the comfort level of any given organization and what do they want to achieve out of their workflow, right? Are they okay with a red zone hybrid, meaning you have something, intact, local, but you also have proxies that are available then in the cloud? Do you really want to go with a private cloud? Now, the downside of a private cloud is that it is obviously managed by someone's company infrastructure, and it's not necessarily built to scale in that they have to add cost to it, right? So if they want to scale up more and more, they might build a model whereby, like Daryl was mentioning, you go to public in certain occasions, you keep private for other purposes. So there's a fit for everybody. Sony C is a pure public, availability, and we viewed that as an appealing offering because we weren't having to invest in the data center infrastructure, right? We're piggybacking off of AWS, and then we build all the scalability and decision making on our own use of encryption, how we choose to do those things, how we make it more secure than other layers might be. That's all of our own doing. So we view that as a competitive advantage because we believe one thing that you tackle over the past 4 or 5 years is adoption. People's adoption and moving into a new workflow, right? How do you go and convince someone to go away from a local only workflow and shipping hard drives all over the world because they feel like they're comfortable with that? But it's also very costly. Your 500 terabytes, for example, I mean, that's a lot of money to spend. And with advantages like Amazon Snowball, you can actually go and take an 80 terabyte drive, pop it right in our back end, ingest it automatically, and we're going to go and customize it, ingest, even generate custom renders if you need to normalize your workflow and now distribute out whatever that spec proxy is that you need to begin your editorial workflow right off the set. So there's a lot of options that are out there, and I think it's grown.
But there's that slip that you get from the shipping company that says that it's being tracked, right?
Well, that's actually, that was one of the things I was thinking about here. Again, I sit more on the, Josh and I probably sit more on the actual development side, and we're still, even though we now are seriously using cloud this year, over the last couple of years, it's really been research and development. We now have some real user stories behind us. We have some, not too many horror stories, but a lot of success stories that are behind us. The problems that I see and the reason that from a development perspective cloud is so sexy is there's a full API out there, there's a full environment for us to actually start to develop to.
API.
Daryl. I'm blanking my
application programmer interface. So it's basically just a way for programmers to talk to the software.
Okay.
Yes, to talk, which I can't do right now. So the nice thing about these public APIs that are out there, that are specifically Amazon, the reason Amazon is so interesting is the depth of that API for developers that are serious about this is huge. It is very deep. When you start to compare that to other cloud infrastructures out there, they're still in development. They're still building out those environments. However, from a business model, we have to have private cloud as an alternative or as an option for our security means that are needed by some of our requests from our clients and things like that. So I think you're definitely going to see a merge of these, or you're going to see a blend of these two being offered.
Yeah, the private cloud gives us a couple other advantages too, right? I mean, because Technicolor is big enough, we can have the scale to have the support people. We can configure our systems and our storage to be high performance and in the right places and inexpensive in the right places, and allow us to kind of build out that whole solution. Our vendors, the people we work with, like the studios, often have some security constraints that we can uniquely meet that's hard for a public cloud vendor to do. So there's really a mix of what you're buying, but the public cloud is out there and being used by a ton of different applications. It's progressing very, very quickly. They do great jobs with their data centers, right? So I've got no complaints against a public cloud solution, but they are different. They're different apples, right? Different depending on what you want.
But what I'm hearing is that having that server in your office behind lock and key doesn't necessarily make it safer.
Right.
And that's the kind of misnomer of this there's this implication with public cloud that it's a variation in the security, but it really isn't a variation in the security. It's a variation in ownership, right? So if it's private cloud, generally the person speaking is talking about the fact that their company owns it, or the company they're referring to owns it, as opposed to Amazon owning it. But you could say Disney's private cloud or Amazon's private cloud. They're private in the context of, well, you could use it, like even Amazon AWS has VPC access that is entirely private, meaning that it can't see the internet, right? You can only ever get to it through this private connection.
Yeah, I like that word ownership. It's a ownership, and for lack of a better, maybe some concept of responsibility.
Yep. And it's important not to just assume that because it's the Amazon cloud or the Google cloud that it's necessarily less secure, and conversely, like you just brought up, because it's a private cloud, it's necessarily more secure. In fact, it's pretty arguable that that's almost definitely not the case because they have some of the biggest PhDs in security at Google and Amazon making sure their systems are secure.
I'd like to go back to something Daryl mentioned, which is support.
Yep.
So, and I run the customer success organization, part of Sony C. And I will say, we've been in business now for 4.5 years, and we pride ourselves on having a very small team, but we support 64,000 users worldwide with a small team. And it really goes to say something about how you can scale something out, make a very good product, deliver it, distribute it, and people don't have problems. Not the same problems you might think, right? The typical problems are more educational, right? Teaching someone and getting someone onboarded to moving from their own workflow.
Problem exists between keyboard and seat.
Exactly.
We don't mention those words anymore. I got in trouble. He's the one who taught me that. That got me in trouble a few times.
But it does lend to the knowledge-based oriented, support portal oriented, help center oriented kind of approach, whereby you see a lot of software as a service models, and that's how they scale. They are not encountering major platform issues. They're encountering issues that are unique. Things that come up once in a while where it's more of a request for functionality than it is more of, or someone learning how to change their workflow. And you then begin to teach them from a different perspective, and they're willing to learn. And I think that's a take-home. That's a lesson for all of us to grasp, is that there are folks out there, no matter how set in their ways they are, they're getting it now.
If you offer them enough money savings and enough, they'll figure it out, right?
The source of it has to be a value problem. Always, right? They have to get value out of the offer that you're putting out there. So if the cost doesn't match the value and the ROI, you're right. You're never going to sell it. You're never going to be able to get their buy-in. But luckily, through Amazon, through other services, you can do some very cost-effective things to scale out, scale back. And that efficiency that we drive helps, generate a lower cost. And that's essential. You have to have that ingredient.
Well, you mentioned SaaS, and as I said earlier, I just like to say the word SaaS. But we're going to talk about that. We're going to be taking a break shortly, but we're going to be talking about software as a service and how that is used in the cloud. I know, Brian, you have a software as a service, and Daryl, you're adopting much more of a software as a service model.
Yep.
SaaS is big S, little a, big S. In case you're wondering, that's another one of those camel case bizarre acronyms that seem to be in vogue these days. But I'm really interested in talking about how software development and software can get spun up this way, having this as your tool. So actually, Brian, I'm gonna let you just jump in there for a minute.
That's kind of the really fun part here. And that, whether it's working with Sony C, working with Daryl, working with Josh here on C4, the cool part is back to this API that, okay, the entire infrastructure for dealing with users, dealing with, I'll start throwing words out, dealing with users, dealing with all the concepts of group management, all that kind of stuff that might need to be handled when I wanted to deploy an application. Someone has already built an application out there for me. There is an app for that, okay? Sony C, Sony Pulse.
Hey, you said there isn't an app. I know. You're waffling now.
I apologize. So there are people that are interested in building those kind of applications up. So me, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to actually go in there. All I have to do is worry about, hey, I'd like to start doing color correction in the cloud. I know of people out there that are working on color correction. Me, I started with something called AutoDCP for DCP film packaging, and that's out there, and it talks to C, has a capability to talk to Pulse. And the other person here, I'd love to have him jump in and tell me his stuff he was just doing, is C4 now even has a little service you just showed out there to calculate C4, and it's super quick to build these things up.
Yeah, if anybody's interested, they can go to ccc.io and just drop a file on the web page, and it will tell you what the C4 ID is. What's interesting is that it doesn't have to send the file anywhere; it's just doing it in the browser. But like you were saying earlier, there's a lot of this infrastructure for cloud has been built around these kinds of meaning apps for web developers, really, right? People who are developers and coders at that level, not for filmmakers, really. That's where tools like Pulse and so forth come in, and tools like you're making come in.
Yeah, the thing I like about before we got up here on the stage, we had a quick discussion about how can we start to get our products to work together. And there are all types of applications I can think about building out there, and I'd love to actually have some type of identifier system out there that I can actually label something instead of an MD5. Checksum used in our industry, since you're going to ask me that later.
Good, you're getting trained, all of you.
That's what the ETC wanted to do when it did all of this open source standardization and framework, was to create mechanisms. The key thing is that in production, unlike other industries, everybody kind of assembles together, does some work, and separates apart again, and everybody kind of wants to do it in their own way, right? And so any system that glues these pieces together has to be tolerant to that reality, right? So you can't assume that everybody on the planet is going to be using Pulse, right? You just can't. So how is that group that does it?
As awesome as it is.
But because they do store all this data, there's going to be some other service that wants to talk to it to get that data. Right? And how do you say which data you want and what it's related to, and IDs like this.
We're going to have to hold that. We're going to go to a break. I'm glad that you guys are all excited, and we're going to hit it as soon as we get back. Thanks so much.